Hi everyone, my name is Josh Fein-Brown. I'm a lecturer, I'm an osteopath, I'm a pain specialist and a naturopath. And today I'm going to talk to you about a subject that's very close to my heart, interoception. And interoception means the feelings that we get from the interior of our body, our ability to sense the state of our bodies, temperature, heart rate, stomach feelings, and even emotions all can be classed under this term interior, perception. Now I'm going to take the explanation for what interoception is and how it relates to pain from an evolutionary lens today. And I really hope that you are able to understand some of these ideas because I think they really are fascinating and they certainly change the way in which I look at myself. So let's start at the very, very beginning. Let's start around 4 billion years ago, 3.8 billion years ago, depending on the estimates that you look at, in some hydrothermal vents underneath the ocean. Now, if you can't see properly, these are hydrothermal vents that I've drawn. And these hydrothermal vents at the bottom of the ocean there, they are harboring the very dawn of life, the very first cells. These rocks are porous, so it has little pockets of relatively stable environment within the hard casings of these volcanic rocks. And these stable environments are perfect in terms of their mineral content, in terms of their chemical constituency to form the basic building blocks of proteins. And somehow, we're not sure how, it might be something to do with a chemical gradient between alkaline and acidity that was driving the reactions for these chemicals to form. We had the very first replicating molecule, RNA. And RNA was a molecule that was able to collect these amino acid proteins, and it was able to build a copy of itself. It was able to replicate. And once you're able to have the first process of replication, you have reproduction. You have the building blocks for life as we know it today. Now, this also can be termed the very first gene. And RNA as a molecule later on became DNA, which is the blueprint for all of our organisms that we have on Earth today. All living organisms have DNA within their cells that code for that organism. It builds that organism. Now, when these RNA molecules somehow left the rocks, what happened is they formed a membrane around them. A little membrane of fat, and just like dissolving fat in water, it doesn't dissolve into the water, it stays separated as an emulsion, and it forms these globules, like little droplets of fat. And this little droplet of fat was able to encase within it and protect it from the sea, which it was encased in, from the outside environment. So this little fat membrane made the membrane of the very first cell. Now, as soon as you have this membrane, you have a crucial difference between just the chemicals swimming around diffused in the soup and a membrane-bound cell. And that is an interior and an exterior. And in order to maintain this cell long enough for it to be able to make new interior via copying itself using the code of the RNA molecules, it needs to maintain this barrier. It needs to maintain its body. And it has to act in its environment in order to do so. It has to know when this little cell is moving towards an environment that might be toxic for it. For example, here in this little E. coli that I've drawn, it's moving towards acid, which is terribly hostile for this little living cell here. And it needs to have some kind of form of detection of this dangerous environment. And this detection comes through the membranes of the cells. These little membranes contain receptors that sense all the time their environment, Just like we do with our eyes and our skin and our other sense organs, we're able to pick up whether we're changing in temperature or whether something might be dangerous, so we can get the hell away from it. Now, these simple E. coli, these simple unicellular organisms, what they do is they're able to detect the chemicals within their environment. And they're able to respond to the detection of those chemicals. Now, their response is usually through some kind of action, through some kind of movement. So ever since the dawn of life, we have been sensing and responding to our environment in order to survive. Now, what these E. coli do is they are able to sense when they have encountered a molecule. So a receptor goes off for encountering a potentially dangerous molecule, and it would take a while for that receptor to go off again. Right next door, there's a receptor of the very same kind, and if that receptor goes off too, then the bacteria knows that it has encountered a higher concentration of this threatening chemical. It's able to say, okay, I've detected this once, and I've detected it twice, and maybe a third time. And because it's starting to repeatedly detect these potentially threatening, noxious chemicals in its environment that may kill it if it carries on moving towards, these receptors are able to trigger a rolling behavior. Quite literally, the bacteria flips itself around and tries to move to a more safe environment, picking up sensing the chemicals in this new environment again. Is it stimulating these noxious receptors or not? Yes or no? If it does, it rolls again and redetects the environment. So even at a very, very small level, even these unicellular organisms are able to exhibit quite advanced behaviors. They're able to move towards, they're able to roll away from, and they're also able to sense and detect other organisms that are the same type. So I've been reading a book recently called Other Minds. If you haven't read it, I highly, highly recommend it. It's excellent, and it talks about the phenomenon of collective behavior, colony behavior of bacteria. And it uses the example of squid, and these squid are able to glow in the dark. How do they do that? Well, inside the squid has certain bacteria, and these bacteria, they're able to release chemicals that say, hey, I'm here. And these chemicals are released, and they're able to be picked up by neighboring bacteria of the same species. And when the neighboring bacteria pick up a chemical that's saying, hey, there's another member of my species nearby, it starts to release more of the chemical that it's releasing to say, hey, I'm here, increasing its concentration of this same chemical. So if you imagine a scenario where you have more and more and more of these bacteria collecting together, they're all releasing chemicals that are saying, hey, I'm here, I exist, and they're all detecting that there is another existing bacteria of the same kind, and as they get together, the more they release, the louder they shout, until you reach a certain crescendo. All of these bacteria release more and more chemical that say, hey, I'm here. And when they gather together in a group, when this chemical reaches a certain threshold, they begin to glow. And this is a kind of behavior that is essentially a social behavior. Because they are recognizing the same species, they're saying, hey, I'm here, and they're changing their behavior only once there is a certain number of those bacteria present. And this is the case for many, many different kinds of unicellular life. They are able to sense whether there are populations of the same kind of bacteria around. They're able to move towards, and they're able to change their behavior once there is a population of them present, once there's a colony. Now, this is extraordinary behavior, and it's very useful for the squid because when they glow, they're able to then prevent themselves from casting a shadow. They tend to hunt at night, and the moonlight coming into the sea, if the squid is here, would cast a shadow on anything underneath it. And the prey have learned to swim away from these shadows because it indicates they're going to be killed. So if they're able to light up, then they cast their own light instead of casting a shadow. And the little prey species underneath don't detect that they're there, so they get eaten. So this is an ingenious symbiosis between unicellular bacteria and multicellular organisms. But we didn't have multicellular organisms for a really, really long time. We're talking over 1 billion years. Life was just simple unicellular organisms. And just to give you an idea of how long that actually is, if we're thinking about the difference between 1 million and 1 billion, how long do you think 1 million seconds is in days? How about 1 billion seconds? Well, 1 million seconds is about 11, not about, but it is 11 days. And 1 billion seconds is 37 years, or 31. Don't quote me on the 37, it's one of those two. But the difference is huge. So for a long, long time, way longer than we have ever walked on this earth as human beings, which is only counted in the thousands of years, we were just unicellular life. So something happened that made the transition between unicellular life and multicellular life. And it's kind of, one of the theories is, we don't understand exactly how this happened yet, but one of the theories is that bacteria or other unicellular organisms formed a colony. They formed a colony that was acting together, changing their behavior. And one of the examples of this is chanoflagellates, which are organisms that are shaped a little bit like the E. coli there. They've got a tail on one end and they're able to swim in a certain direction. And when they collect together, they form a little circle with a space in the middle and their little swimming tails on the outside. And they start to have collective behavior. They're able to communicate to each other via releasing chemicals into their central canal. For example, if the whole organism is moving this way, the back ones are swimming hard to get them to move in the forwards direction, and they encounter a dangerous environment here. These cells at the top here, these little chanoflagellates, are able to say, hey, what the fuck are you doing? We're moving towards a dangerous environment. And they're able to signal via this little central canal, diffusing molecules that say to the guys at the back here, you need to stop swimming. You need to turn off your swimmers. I'm turning on mine on the other end of the organism so we can move away from this thing that's dangerous. And a unique thing that happens with these specific creatures is when they're stressed, when the environment is difficult, there's a scarcity of food or the environment is stressful for their organism, they do something quite extraordinary. One of these little cells says, okay guys, I'm gonna give up my independence. I'm gonna give up this ability I have to swim away from you and replicate and divide and survive all on my own for the sake of the survival of us as a collective. And how I'm gonna do that is I'm gonna specialize into a gamete. I'm gonna specialize and split my DNA in half and turn into a sperm or an egg cell. So that you guys can stay together, meaning you don't have to separate in order to reproduce. Because when the environment is stressful and there is a lack of resources or there's a lot of threat, it's much more useful for the survival of the colony to stay together, not to separate. And in order to reproduce without making sex cells, they would have to separate and then divide. So one of them says, I'm sacrificing myself. I'm going to become a sperm, or I'm going to become an egg. And this specialization, this giving up of your individuality for the sake of the whole, is the very dawn of tissues. And we as human beings are made up of many, many different kinds of specialized cells. Muscles, liver cells, pancreatic cells, brain cells, all of these different kinds of cells are working together in order to create this thing that we have, which is a body, to form our organism. But this specialization is a pretty unique step for a little unicellular organism to make, this sacrificing of an individual function for the function of the whole. Now, this worked well for those little chanoflagellates, which are microscopic. They're tiny little organisms. But when multicellular life became bigger, there was a problem that had to be overcome. And this problem is this problem of communication. Because it's all well and good diffusing a molecule across a central canal when you're tiny, But if you're massive, loads and loads of different cells, and you're trying to communicate via diffusion across this tiny little inward membrane, it's going to take minutes for the chemical at the top, the cells at the top that are signaling potentially danger, to communicate to the cells at the back which are swimming towards that danger. And by that time, the whole organism would be engulfed in this terrible acidic chemical soup and die. So evolution needs to find a solution for this size problem. It needs to find a solution that enables rapid communication between one end of an organism to another, between the sensor that's picking up the environment and the effector, the muscle that is responding to that environment. And we know that cells, even unicellular organisms, have the potential to be electrical. The cells are able to send electrical signals because they have a charge across their membrane. Inside the cell is relatively negative, outside the cell is relatively positive, and you can change the level of relative positivity and negativity across the membrane and you create action potentials. Most cells have this capacity. But the genius step was to elongate one of these cells so that you connect a receptor at one end of an elongated cell, which communicates electronically across its membrane, and that connects with an effector at the other end, i.e. a muscle or a gland or something that releases chemicals, and you suddenly have this ability to rapidly communicate because you're traveling now at the speed of electricity, not at the speed of diffusion. So, nerve cells are born. Nerve cells are born and enable organisms to grow much larger and have much more complex forms of action, much more specific forms of communication. You now have the ability for a nerve cell to pick up a specific kind of message, let's say, for example, light, and respond to a specific kind of organ, let's say, a muscle. And what we see is that the very first muscles that we have in evolution, the muscle as a specialized cell, come with the evolution of nerve cells. So ever since the very, very beginning of nervous systems, they have evolved to mediate sensing and acting, transmitting sensation and coordinating action to respond to their environment. So, let's fast forward a bit. We have the humble jellyfish. And jellyfish, whether that's a comb jelly, which is actually a different kind of species than a jellyfish, they've got different roots. But there's the current understanding of where animal life came from, animal life being life that moves around. They came from either jellyfish or a jellyfish-like creature, or a comb jelly, which are very, very simple organisms, but they're able to move in their environment, which is a key thing. And the nervous systems of these early species were not centralized, they didn't have a brain, they were just decentralized neural nets. And these decentralized neural nets were able to be sensitive to their environment, just like those single-celled organisms. And in a key way, they were able to sense light and move towards it or away from it. And they're also able to coordinate protective behaviors. They're able to coordinate a withdrawal away from something that's poking them really hard. And they have, the nerves that do this are called high threshold mechanical nociceptors. Noci meaning noxious, ceptor meaning receptor, and they're picking up any potential noxious mechanical stimulation that might damage this particular organism. And they're able to withdraw away from it. And these nerve cells are able to contract a ring of muscle that's at the base of the jellyfish, causing it to beat and swim away from that potential mechanical threat, hopefully. So this is a very simple action. All we have to do is contract one ring of muscle cells. That's it. It just contracts and shortens the base of the organism and tries to move, not really in a specific direction. It's hard for the jellyfish to choose a direction, but just away from the thing that is threatening to it. And you don't need a very complex nervous system in order to do this. And it's very, very different from the kind of nervous systems that we see, not in radially symmetrical organisms, like jellyfish or like starfish, for example, but in bilaterally symmetrical organisms, like us. We have a bilateral symmetry. If I cut myself in half, I have a relatively similar, albeit left versus right, but I have a left and a right. I'm symmetrical bilaterally. And when you have a bilateral symmetry, you have the ability to coordinate two different sides of your body. And when you have bilateral symmetry, which may have developed from crawling on the ground, because if you're an organism, an early organism, let's say a worm, and you're crawling along the ground, it's very useful to have your mouth at one end and your anus at the other end. Because if you have your anus and your mouth at the same end, you get into a really uncomfortable situation. So this bilateral symmetry is a key thing that most animals share. And what it means is that you have a directionality to your movement. You're moving towards something, like the little organism crawling along the sea floor. And you have your specialized sense organs at one end. You have your eyes at one end of your organism and your butt at the other. And so if you have all of the specialized sense organs, like we do as humans, the eyes, the nose, the ears, the ones that are very good at picking up our environment, it makes sense to have a population of nerve cells that are able to coordinate and synthesize all of this information you're getting. So with the bilateral organization of organisms, we start to get the most primitive brains.